The book is a bit frightening at the end because the point I'm trying to make is a lot of people think the pandemic is over, but it's not over. And there's some research I quoted in the book that showed that many generations after the Spanish flu, which was in around 1919, 1920, 3 or 4 generations after that, there was still a psychological impact that was measurable. So that's a pretty interesting and frightening idea that this is a pandemic that's going to have an emotional and psychological impact for generations to come.
Hello, I'm here with Dr. Raj Persaud, eminent renowned psychiatrist, known for a host of books, such as the Simply Irresistible and Staying Sane, and now author of this new heavyweight, very heavy, good bicep curling material, The Mental Vaccine for Covid-19. Master of several TED Talks, and a guy that pulls no punches, so I'm led to believe. So please take it easy on me. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for, this is my first ever interview, and I want to, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm absolutely terrified, and I've shirked away from doing anything to the camera my whole life due to shyness, body dysmorphic disorder, and all that kind of fun stuff. But interestingly, I found something quite fun in your book, that there was a chapter on loneliness, actually. You had a story about a real-life Full Monty situation where at first, people are inherently worried and awkward and shy about shedding their clothes. But hopefully I won't be doing that unless things get really interesting today. But it inspired me to embrace my fear and my awkwardness, which will be evidently apparent. And it's a good point to start, about loneliness in the pandemic. Can you expand upon that for me?
Well, the book was written, first of all, it's entitled The Mental Vaccine for Covid-19 because I noticed that everyone was emphasizing during the pandemic the idea that vaccines were going to save us. And there was a lot of emphasis on a vaccine rollout, how much was being spent on vaccines, which nation was ahead of which nation in terms of the number of vaccines being delivered. So there was a natural psychological tendency to see the problem of the pandemic as being basically a problem to do with physical medicine and curing people or preventing them from catching the thing. But in fact, all the evidence is, although COVID-19 and coronavirus is a serious illness to be avoided at all costs, in fact, the biggest impact of the pandemic will be mental, on our mental health and our emotional health, for various reasons we may discuss later. But it struck me that no one was discussing a mental vaccine, and yet a mental vaccine is needed, in a sense, more than a physical vaccine. And what would a mental vaccine look like? And the problem is that a physical vaccine can be very specific to a specific virus, but a mental vaccine, and this is why I wrote the book, would have to attack all the different problems that the pandemic presents psychologically, one of which was loneliness, which was a big problem during the pandemic because of the lockdown, and people couldn't socialize. And I think that was underestimated by governments who proposed lockdowns in not seeing the big impact that social isolation was going to lead to. It led to, for example, a dramatic rise in domestic violence, and probably a lot of violence towards children as well, et cetera, et cetera. But let's go back to the key question about loneliness. And the other point I tried to make throughout the book, going back to your point about pulling no punches, I believe the answers to all these questions is usually very surprising and often quite challenging, and that most of the answers as presented by the media, the mainstream media, are not just completely wrong answers to these problems, like the answer to loneliness, but they're actually usually counterproductive. So let's start with an analysis of loneliness, which was a very common problem. People think loneliness, the solution is find ways to end loneliness by presenting people with socializing opportunities of some kind. In fact, really, loneliness is about something to do with you, which is always a very challenging problem or position to take, which is that there's something that you're doing that's leading to isolation. And people find that very challenging. They think, I'm isolated because the government imposed a lockdown. But if you look around the world, people came up with very innovative solutions to loneliness. Some people hung around in their front garden and just chatted to anyone that went by. So actually, loneliness is really about overcoming your own personal inhibitions to socializing. Loneliness is something you do to yourself. And that's a very challenging position that people will find perhaps irritating and provocative, but also is liberating because it means there are things you can do about it. And the deeper question is, why are you inhibited? Why are you isolating yourself? And usually that's to do with overcoming awkwardness. What's the first thing you say to people? Feeling that you're going to be judged negatively by other people, feeling you're some kind of loser, hence your need to overcome loneliness by engaging with people. When you look at lonely people and compare them with people who are not lonely, there are personality differences that explain it. And my argument in the book is you can learn some relatively simple techniques whereby you can overcome loneliness by changing your approach to social interaction.
Okay. Well, this enforced solitude, as it were, has challenged people to confront this head on. They either have the tools or don't have the tools. There's also the alternative side, which I just thought of, as where this lack of the ability to be alone, the lack of solitude because you're surrounded and you're in lockdown with your kids and your wife and whatnot. So there are these two opposing things where you don't have enough time for yourself, you have too much time for yourself.
Yes, and that's another very important point that came up. I mean, one of the things the pandemic did was it said that it led to a lot of divorces. Well, did the pandemic itself lead to a lot of divorces, or was it the case that those relationships were in trouble before, and the pandemic held a mirror up to us, a very uncomfortable mirror, because we weren't allowed to escape and pursue all the distractions we normally pursue that made us escape some central problems in our lives. The pandemic held up a mirror to our lives, and it was often very uncomfortable viewing. So a lot of divorces may have occurred that may not otherwise have occurred, but those relationships may have been problematic or fractured and came under increased pressure during the pandemic. So this is another very important point. The book is meant to be an antidote to another very famous book, which was a book that everyone said everyone was reading during the pandemic, which was The Plague by Albert Camus, a famous French existentialist philosopher. He wrote it in the 1940s, and the story in The Plague, it's a novel, but it's meant to be a bit deeper than just a novel. It's meant to be telling us something about the way that we lead our lives. In the novel, there's a North African town that is attacked by an infection that is transmitted through rats. Hence the title of the book is The Plague. So the novel is about how this town reacts to all the problems we had during the last year, like lockdowns and isolation and smuggling and scams and fraud and so on. One of the points that Camus is making is that actually the plague isn't the rats and the bug you get. It actually was there all along. In other words, people were bored all along, and the plague just highlights and brings to the fore problems that people already had. And my book is an attempt to make the point that actually the plague illuminates, or that plague, as in Albert Camus' book and the current pandemic, all it does is it shows you problems that were already inherent in your personality that you were having not to address because you were distracted by going night clubbing every Friday night. And now you're not allowed to go night clubbing every Friday night. And because you're all the things that distracted you from examining your life have been removed, you're exposed to examining your life and confronting your life, and often there's a very uncomfortable answer when you do that.
I really didn't want to read your book. It was maybe arrogance, maybe naivety on my part. I thought I've been plagued with mental health issues my whole life, and I thought, how could something as effectively minor for me, who has been in lockdown of sorts myself, I've spent years in not going out of my house or whatever, and so on, how could that affect my mental health? How could anything affect my life. Looking back on the last year, I did get divorced. It happened during lockdown. It started during lockdown. My wife left me, which led to a resurgence of some very severe, dormant, borderline traits. I had to go back on the dreaded benzodiazepines. I had to leave my kids to come back to England from France in order to seek treatment, to go to mental hospital. So for me, yes, it did hold a mirror up to the problems in my relationship, and quite quickly everything devolved into madness, and it was a terrible year. This is quite an all-encompassing piece. It's relevant outside the hysteria of COVID. And you presented lots of age-old strategies that can be implemented in regular daily life. Was that the aim from the start, to make something that approached COVID as merely a condensed example of our deeper psychological vulnerabilities?
Well, you're making a very good point. I mean, you had a particular experience of the pandemic. Certain things happened to you, right? There was no one pandemic. Everyone had their own pandemic. And the point I'm trying to make in the book is that each person, as a reflection of their own personality, had to contend with an extraordinary set of circumstances that people had never had to contend with before. And because no one had to contend with it before, they had to work out for themselves their own solutions or their own reaction. And as a result, each person's reaction was particular to them and their personality. So it was a challenge to try and capture that. But I also thought there were some very useful psychological ideas that people needed, which were not being disseminated, to help people cope with their own personal torture or turmoil that was represented by the particular problems of the pandemic. Now, one particular problem of the pandemic was, and there were many, which is why the book has several different chapters focusing on different aspects, is that psychologically, what are we looking for when we're under stress or when we face danger of some kind? It could be social threat, like a bullying boss at work, or it could be a physical threat, like a virus that seems in the atmosphere and can produce a very dangerous illness. And we have to not socialize or not go out. And even if people have just been out to the shops and come back, you may catch it from them. So one of the points the book makes is that deep down, what we're all looking for is what's called a place of safety. That place of safety may be a psychological place, or it could be a physical place. So let us say you were on the deck of the Titanic, and the Titanic had become very dangerous because it hit an iceberg. You're looking for a place of safety, which is no longer the Titanic, but is to get into a lifeboat. So that is a metaphor for what's going on whenever people are in trouble. So sometimes that place of safety is crawling inside a bottle. In terms of an alcoholic, may be drinking heavily, and that represents their place of safety. We're all looking for a place of safety, a refuge. Now, when you've got an unseen threat like a virus that seems to be everywhere, even inside your own house, and whatever you do, how many times you wash your hands, there was a chapter on OCD, you're still exposed to threat. What can you do? What becomes a place of safety from an unseen airborne threat that can be all around you at any one moment in time? So solving that enigma of the place of safety is a very important point. And we all need to find one, and we all need to understand the difference between a healthy place of safety and an unhealthy one. So to take a personal example, we're not meant to use personal examples, but I play a lot of tennis, I play a lot of sports. There's a sense in which, for me, a tennis court is my place of safety. I'm not worried about the stresses in my life at the time I'm playing tennis. It's better that it's something physically active and perhaps quite good for you, like tennis, than crawling inside a bottle and drinking heavily. But we all need a place of safety. One of the most interesting questions I ask clients when they come to see me, and I often see, because I work in private practice in Harley Street, some highly successful individuals who work very hard and are top of their fields. I say to them, and one of my early questions, what do you do for fun? And it's very interesting. I get a very blank look back from a lot of people who are professional, very, very successful. They don't seem to do anything for fun, and they think actually they're going to be taken less seriously if they're having a lot of fun in their lives. But having productive, non-dangerous fun is actually a very important place of safety. And many times even people who are not in mental health trouble are heading for it because they haven't worked out that central question. What is a place of safety in our lives?
Brilliant chapter that I love in your book about how animals, they get anxious but don't worry.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about that because it's a very important point.
Whilst as humans, between these, so animals, they get anxious in emergency situations, running away from lions or people trying to take photos of them, but between that they do not worry. While this is the big point about human beings, is that we tend to ruminate, we tend to get anxious, worry about the future. Are we doomed by our own evolutionary success, as it were? You know?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Let's talk a bit about that. Now, we're going to get into a lot of trouble with animal lovers and people who have pets, because the statement, animals feel anxiety or fear, just like humans do, but animals don't worry, causes a cascade of trouble. We're going to get a lot of negative comments from people who said, well, I think my pet dog or my pet does worry. So I don't want to get bogged down into a fight over that. I'm not an animal expert, but what I am saying is that the field of psychology and psychiatry and anthropology and behavioral science believes, so don't blame me, I'm just the messenger here, believes that one important distinction between animals and us, and it is very important understanding this point in terms of understanding what mental health looks like, is that animals, we share with animals because we share an evolutionary history which goes back millions of years. Animals and us, because we are animals, have a system built into us which is very well evolved and includes the glands like the adrenal medulla, which secretes adrenaline. So when a lion is bounding towards us across the prairie, as it did hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were cavemen wandering through the African prairie, the adrenaline would kick in, we feel fear, and that fear, a very strong emotion, has survival value, and it leads us to escape the feared object, which is the lion running towards us. So the example I use in the book, and it's a famous example that I've referenced in terms of the psychological research done on this, are the example of the antelope and the lion. So the antelope lives in fear of the lion, because the lion can burst out of the undergrowth at any moment and eat an antelope. And if you observe herds of antelope, they graze, they eat, they look up every now and again to check there are no lions, okay? But they are relatively relaxed while they're eating. Suddenly a lion arrives and starts running after the herd, and the herd bolts. So the antelope start running. The antelope is definitely in the grip of fear at that moment and is running away from the lion. Very often, and it's very interesting how actually the percentages seem to be loaded heavily in favor of the antelope when the lion's trying to chase one down, quite often the antelope escapes the lion. And once the antelope has checked there's no lion on the horizon anymore because they've outrun the lion, they stop and they eat. And they are relatively relaxed because they know they've escaped the threat. In other words, they're in their safe place. They have a definite sense of safety and they have a definite sense of danger. The problem for human beings, because we evolved this thing called a brain, which has higher cognitive aspects that antelopes don't have, is we can do a thing called worry. And what worry is, there is no lion on the horizon, but you're worried there might be. So it's as if there is a lion. In other words, worry means you carry danger and threat with you wherever you are. Your bullying boss may be in the office, but you're worrying about your bullying boss before you even get to the office. So the journey to the office or your weekends at home get transformed into dangerous places despite the fact your boss isn't at home with you, because worry allows you to negatively anticipate the future and believe there is threat. So I'm not going to go into the solution here, but there is a very important solution to the problem of worry as opposed to the problem of fear. Now, the other point I want to make, and it's a very important point that the book tries to make, is we need to start by labeling the phenomena in our heads. Have I got a fear or have I got a worry? And what is the difference between the two? And labeling phenomena is extremely important. Now, one sign as to whether you've actually got a good therapist or not, and my next book is about this question, about how to know, how to find a good therapist, is any therapist that launches into treating your problem without saying, let's label what's going on in your head, let's have a conversation where we are clear about what's going on, and we label and distinguish between things like anxiety and worry, etc., etc. Any therapist that just launches straight into the treatment, which a lot of therapists do, you need to leave quietly, because that's a terrible therapist. Any therapist that starts with, let's hear clearly what you understand to be going on inside your head, and let's label it. And also, any therapist that doesn't define what a worry is, because worry has a very specific technical definition that distinguishes it from fear and anxiety. Any therapist that's not familiar with any of that stuff, you need to get out the room, close the door quietly, and leave, and find a therapist who does start off with this very key point. Let's label what's going on inside our heads. Only after we've labeled it correctly, then we can start to handle it, because we all need to handle ourselves. And this is another deep point about evolution. Our minds are a problem, because our minds allow us to see Angelina Jolie walk into the room and think, ooh, I fancy Angelina Jolie. I desire her. Unfortunately, you haven't got the equipment, physical, mental, or financial, to get Angelina Jolie. You're just not hot enough. But your mind doesn't get to that bit. Your mind doesn't say, Angelina Jolie, not possible, switch off the desire bit. She's dead to me now, okay? Instead, what happens is, Angelina Jolie walks into the room, you think, wow, I think I've got a chance. You have got no chance. I'm not picking on Angelina Jolie, but just any specific example. Your mind creates desires, expectations, wants, and needs, which it writes checks. You can't bank. You can't pay out. And that is one of the central problems. So understanding the problem your mind represents to you is a very important part of management of your mind and therefore mental health.
Billy Bob Thornton got Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, but that's because he's Billy Bob Thornton.
Oh, right, yeah.
That's an important thing to understand.
I really don't have a chance with her, do I? I missed my opportunity.
Yeah, I think you got distracted the minute I mentioned Angelina Jolie, and I lost you there. And I lost you at that point. You see the point I'm making? You see the way our brains work?
No, Yeah.
So what you need to do when you see Angelina Jolie is think to yourself, am I anything like Billy Bob Thornton, in terms of like a Hollywood A-list megastar? No, I'm not. We have difficulty accepting that.
You are, and I've watched someone who really challenges the status quo, who really seems to go against the kind of normal psychological interventions that occur. You push boundaries, you risk upsetting people, which perhaps you enjoy, but perhaps that's necessary. Do you think that's the way forward, rather than indulging in our pathologies, in our diagnoses given to us?
Well, you're right. My position is viewed by other people as very challenging and provocative and somewhat irritating, I have no doubt. But I do have very strong views that, and I'm going to say something very irritating, the vast majority of psychiatry, psychology, therapy, the therapy industry, for want of a better word, is barking up the wrong tree. And it is not just getting it wrong, it's actually damaging people and is dangerous. So let's take one example. People are often in the need of downloading and ventilating, and they need tea and sympathy, for want of a better word. And to some extent, therapy can do that. But therapy can never be just that. Therapy cannot just be kindness and acceptance of you. If you are really going to grow as an individual and become more resilient and deal with the brutal and cruel world that it is out there, then you do need to be challenged, because we grow through challenge. So let's take a physical fitness analogy. How do you become physically fit? Do people come around and just talk to you nicely and then you become physically fitter? No, you've got to get up at 5:30 in the morning and go for a run. And why is running or lifting weights in the gym, why does that make you more physically fit? And why? That's because you put your body under strain. You test your body. Every time you lift a weight that your muscles were never used to, your muscles grow. If you only ever lift weights your muscles are very used to and can lift very easily, your muscles do not grow. So if you take the physical fitness analogy, if you want to become physically fitter, you are going to be challenging your body, putting your body under strain in a graded manner, okay, and then in a graded manner, day after day, your body grows and responds to the strain by becoming fitter, the same applies to mental fitness or mental health. And that means any good therapist worth their salt, while they are kind and supportive, also challenges you to see what you are doing to yourself that's not so good, and the illusions you have about yourself, and the things you are avoiding doing that you really need to do. At the heart of all psychiatric, psychological, and emotional disorder is usually something you need to confront, something you need to do that you're refusing to do for various reasons. And what you're looking for is a different answer. You're looking for the answer which is easy. So one of my favorite analogies is we were the last two people on the deck of the Titanic. It hit an iceberg, the boat's going down, water is sloshing around our ankles. I look over the side of the boat and I say, I see a cold, icy jump into the North Atlantic Sea. It's a horrible jump, but I see people make the jump, they survive it, they swim to a lifeboat, they live. So we got two options. We stay on board the boat, it's going down, we will die, but there is an orchestra playing, and there seem to be some nice deck chairs, we'll be comfortable, or we get off the boat, it'll be a horrible jump, but we will live. Life is about that dilemma. And a lot of therapy says, stay on board the boat. We're going to be nice and warm and cuddly.
So why, if there's no positive outcome, why do they do that? Just for the short term?
Because the patient says, I look over the side of the boat, it's a cold, icy jump, I don't want to do the jump. And the patient says, help me feel like doing the jump. And when I feel better, then I'll do the jump. And I'm afraid to tell you something. The boat's going down, the water's around our ankles. We haven't got time to help you feel like doing the jump, point number one. Point number two, the fact you don't feel like doing the jump, despite the fact the boat is clearly going down and you face death, means there's very little that I can do that will help you feel like doing the jump. I'm afraid, and here's an answer that no one wants to hear, but it's the brutal truth. You need to do the jump, and then you'll feel like doing the jump. A lot of time in life, you've got to do something you don't want to do, and then afterwards, you'll feel like doing it. You've got to get up at 5:30 in the morning to go running. You don't feel like doing it the first time, the second time, the third time. It's like root canal treatment. But by the 10th time, you start feeling like doing it. Here's the key question. What is the secret to human transformation? What is the secret that helps us change and become better people? That's the million-dollar question. And I think most of therapy is supplying the wrong answer. Most of therapy is saying, have a conversation with a nice, warm, cuddly person, and that will transform you. Sometimes that works. Very rarely does it work, actually.
This probably ties in with your forthcoming book about NHS treatment. I can only imagine that I've been through it all, about how inadequate it is. Is it really just about keeping people, I don't know why ice seems the Titanic, on ice, just keep them okay, because it's too much stress for them, to the therapists, to involve themselves in the consequences that may or may not come up? And this brings me to another point. Is this very proactive approach, does it have drawbacks with people who are psychologically oppressed in very severe ways? Yeah.
Okay, well, again, very, very good questions. But the first thing I want to say is the NHS and private therapy as well, what's really going on is people are being processed, okay? Is anything real happening in terms of real change occurring? I'm not convinced that's really happening. There's a lot of warm bodies in a building doing stuff. They're seeing patients, conversations are occurring, appointments are made, come back next week, we'll talk again, blah, blah, blah. My question is, if you try to lift the veil behind that bureaucracy, is anyone actually getting better? What is meaningful that's occurring in terms of personal change? That's the million-dollar question. The other point I have to make is hundreds of thousands of years before the whole therapy industry occurred, how on earth did people cope? How on earth do people cope in parts of the world where there are no therapists? My point is life can be therapy. But for life to be therapy, you have to know how to make that work. You don't necessarily need to go and see a therapist to make that work. And my book says you can teach it to yourself. how to make life therapy. And one of the things you need to do is challenge your own therapist quite often, which is, again, I'm amazed how passive people are. One first question you should ask is, what qualifies you to be a therapist? And people can have qualifications, I don't mind that, but what I want to hear, to some extent, and I don't think patients challenge therapists enough, is why do you do this difficult work? It is very difficult work. What is your motivation? That's the million-dollar question as well. Why do we do what we do? And very rarely do therapists ever get asked that question.
Well,
and patients should ask that question.
But patients are there because they're psychologically vulnerable in
Yes.
deep need of
Yes.
help, and
Yeah,
they
you're right.
they
Yes.
can't.
Yeah.
We're getting onto this a different.
Yeah, but I'll go back to your point about when people are deeply unwell. I agree that challenging them, you're right. There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of sophistication and subtlety in therapy. And you have to sense if a patient can really cope with the we need to jump off the Titanic approach. And some people can't. I accept that point. And they need to be nurtured and there needs to be tea and sympathy and kindness and support as opposed to challenge.
So something that really made my brain hurt is that the quote is, happiness was linked to being a taker rather than a giver, whereas meaningfulness went more with being a giver than a taker. Higher levels of worry and stress and anxiety were linked to more meaningfulness and less happiness. So how can two intrinsically linked states of being be so hard to attain simultaneously? Is it one or the other? Can one be happy without meaning and vice versa? And this is specifically very important to me. I'm a parent, and there's that parental paradox where parents who spend more time with children have more meaning but are less happy. I can't compute this, so can you give me the answer?
Okay, so basically this is a chapter in the book about happiness, which is a subject people are very interested in and concerned about. And we can't go into it in too much detail because it's a big subject. But first of all, one of the points I make is people don't really define happiness properly. And like going back to the point I made about therapists need to help you label what's going on inside your head correctly. So the label happiness is bandied around, but what exactly does the word mean? And one of the key points I make in the book is actually there's more than one kind of happiness. So anyone who starts talking to you about happiness but doesn't define the term properly, again, close the door quietly and walk away. We won't go into the definition of happiness right now, but the research indicates there's two kinds of people in life who are pursuing and sometimes getting close to, but never getting quite to happiness. One is people who are pursuing the meaningful life, and the other are people who are pursuing the happy life. The meaningful life is you notice things are not right around you. It could be locally things are not right around you, like your trains don't run on time, or your therapist isn't very good, or the local health service isn't very good, or your local school is not very good at teaching your children. Listen, the world is full of faults, things that don't work right, okay? You notice something that's quite important to you that isn't working right around you, and you decide to do something about it. So you talk to the headmaster who's in charge of the school that's teaching your children. You say, the education you're providing is lamentable and we need to fix it. The people who are pursuing the meaningful life are trying to fix things that are wrong around them. And as a result, they enter into conflict with people and they have quite stressful lives. But because they fix things and they campaign and the school does improve sometimes, they then become slightly happier as a result of the school improving. The meaningful life inevitably leads you into quite stressful situations. You tend to be argumentative at parties. People say, something, and then you think what they said isn't quite right. You argue with them. You're a difficult person. You're argumentative, and you're not happy when the train doesn't run on time. You write a letter of complaint. That is the meaningful life, and we need people who pursue the meaningful life because they find cures for cancer and they find vaccines.
And these are the successful people that you deal with who are stressed and worried, and these are the people that make things, and the happy people.
There's people who are pursuing happiness, which says, I notice that if I was to complain to my headmaster who's teaching my kids that the school's terrible, that's not going to go very well and it's going to be full of conflict. So I'll just be quiet at the parent-teachers meeting and I'll just be passive. And instead, I'll go home and watch Netflix. And that will be happiness. And there is a sense in which there is a secret to happiness there, which is turn a blind eye to problems and instead just take stuff that cheers you up. It could be Netflix, it could be Prozac, it could be heroin. Okay, there's a tendency to notice conflict but avoid it. There is a deep truth there that if you keep pursuing conflict with people, you won't end up being very happy. So the point I'm trying to make is you need to make some tough choices. You can't say, I want to be happy, and at the same time say, the fact that my kids are having a poor education is making me unhappy. The deeper question is what will make us happy and what makes us unhappy. And if you want to pursue meaning in life, then it does mean you're going to enter into conflict with the world, but you also need to be able to survive the world. And I'm saying I don't necessarily have the answer for everyone, but each individual has to work out an answer for themselves that makes sense. In other words, you have to know the limits to the meaningful life. For you, it's for you to decide. Some people who are political activists devote their lives to the meaningful life, and they get imprisoned, and they think that's okay, because as far as they're concerned, they're trying to change the world. If you don't want to get imprisoned for a political cause, and instead you want to watch a certain amount of Netflix and play a certain amount of tennis and have your kids educated, then you're going to have to make some sacrifices on the meaningful life front, and instead pursue a certain amount of hedonism, a certain amount of passivity in the face of life's difficulties. It's for you to decide where to set the thermometer, as it were, on that point. And that's the key point I'm trying to make in terms of some of the answers or challenges people have to confront if they want happiness. There is a tension between the happy life and the meaningful life.
And it's a matter of balance and acceptance in a way.
Yes. What is the right balance for you personality-wise, given your personality? That's the key point.
Okay.
So there is no one size fits all. It's you understanding yourself. For example, why did I write the book? It was quite stressful writing the book. It meant during the lockdown, instead of doing other things I could have done, which might have been slightly more fun, I engaged in the meaningful life, and I produced a book because I saw around me a lot of problems. I thought the advice, the mental health advice that was coming through the media was terrible. Okay, I could have just been passive and just accepted that, but I decided to sit down and write a book that challenge it and provoke it. And to some extent, that led to a lot of stress with the editors, a lot of stress with the publishers, etc., etc., etc. But to me, I'm doing something meaningful. Writing a book isn't necessarily the answer for everyone, and you will take a hit on the happiness front while you're pursuing the meaningful life. But again, it's for you to decide in terms of what fits your personality. That's the point I'm making.
Okay. Well, your book terrified me by the end, but that's possibly because I'm more easily terrified than your average person. I felt you did allude to Camus and the plague, and I haven't read it, but I assume it's a bad ending.
Well, you're right, actually. That's a very insightful point. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that reading Camus does make you feel suicidal, and he does confront suicide as one of the central questions in life. So Camus is deeply pessimistic about the idea that life is a problem that can be solved. My book is, as an antidote to Camus, hugely more optimistic about that. In fact, Camus says that part of the reason why the plague represents a problem is the plague comes along as actually in a deep sense, an unsolvable problem. But what we do is we switch on the TV at night and our politicians say, we're solving the problem. Relax, we'll do a lockdown, that will solve the problem, and we'll throw money at vaccines, and this will solve the problem. Our politicians are constantly telling us life is a solvable problem. Camus says, to some extent, we're seduced by that. Life is not an entirely solvable problem. Bad things will happen to us, and there's not actually a huge amount we can do about some of that. And Camus' view is some acceptance of that point is actually being a little bit more in touch with reality. Remember, Camus' position is also that life is fundamentally absurd. It's not just that it makes no sense, because he doesn't believe in God. There is no hidden meaning. It's worse than that. It's actually absurd. Good people will die early, bad things will happen to good people, bad people will do well, as often happened in the pandemic. There's a huge amount of scamming going on, and a lot of people made a lot of money. It wasn't just the virus that made a killing.
No. What the take home, which again, maybe it was my stance on life, is that the mental vaccine, it's so important because the emotional toll, the after effects will emotionally and mentally will far exceed the health impact of COVID for the future. And this is, we're talking about, you alluded to you referenced the Spanish flu and how generations suffered psychologically from that, and how in utero the babies will feel the stress of their mothers in lockdown, and that will have an impact on their mental health. Is there anything that we can do to mitigate this terrible kind of disastrous outcome?
Well, that's a very important point, and the book is a bit frightening at the end, because the point I'm trying to make is a lot of people think the pandemic is over, but it's not over. And there's some research I quote in the book that showed that many generations after the Spanish flu, which was in around 1919, 1920, 3 or 4 generations after that, there was still a psychological impact that was measurable. So that's a pretty interesting and frightening idea, that this is a pandemic that's going to have an emotional and psychological impact for generations to come. And our politicians have a nasty tendency to want to reassure us and say, we'll throw more therapists at the problem and it'll all be okay relatively quickly. The other problem is, I don't care how many therapists they throw at the problem, it will be impossible for therapists, an army of therapists, to tackle the mental health impact of the pandemic. Hence the book, which is a self-help guide, how people can help themselves, is a very important idea, because the idea that we'll just wait for more therapists to be trained and thrown at us and that will solve the problem is fundamentally flawed, I think. Towards the end of the book, there is a chapter where I discuss Freud's response, because a lot of people don't realize that Sigmund Freud lost a daughter to Spanish flu. And it's slightly puzzling as to whether, and there's a debate about whether that had an impact, given he lived through it. And he was quite right slap bang in the middle of his career. He died in 1939. The pandemic was in 1919, 1920, around that time, and he lost a daughter to it. How come it doesn't really occur much more in his writings? And actually, I think one of the most poignant things that Freud ever said was not in his books, but in a letter he wrote to a friend of his, because the friend had a son that died, and Freud is comforting him. And it's very interesting, because in a way Freud steps outside of being the professional therapist. He's talking to a friend, and what he says is very moving. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but about the notion, actually, that to some extent suffering in life is inevitable, but also the grief is a price we pay for love. So I thought it was very wise and moving words, he says, which again is quite an important idea or antidote to a lot of the terrible, very trite, superficial psychological advice that's offered during this pandemic.
I have the quote here, which I shan't read.
You can read it if you want to.
It's beautiful. I wrote it down because it was so... Freud is, I mean, one of the things he wrote is, I found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience, most are trash. Yet he was a kind and tolerant person, and interestingly, he didn't believe that any scientific advances of neuroscience would alleviate human suffering. It's really just about us understanding ourselves and whatnot.
And relationships. He thought the answer would be with our relationship with ourselves and with other people. And there's a deep truth there. I mean, I'm not a big fan of a lot of things that Freud said, but that idea that the answer doesn't lie in neuroscience or in chemistry or in a deeper understanding of the brain is a very important idea, because he anticipated, 100 years before now, basically, that all the advances that are supposedly happening in neuroscience don't really seem to be benefiting patients at the end of it. And that's a big, again, problem the therapy industry is not directly confronting and saying. It's true. There are massive advances in our understanding of molecular biology that are leading to definite improvements in cancer treatment, okay? What's going on? Why is there this gap between the fact there's scientific advances occurring in the way we understand how the brain works, just as much as there's scientific advances in understanding how cells work, which explains why there are fantastic new treatments for cancer? Where are the treatments for mental illness that should be arising out of the neuroscience breakthroughs that are happening every week? They're not happening. And it's, again, something the therapy world doesn't want to say. And Freud explained why it's never going to happen, to some extent. And it's really because you're looking in the wrong place for the problem. The problem is in our relationship with ourselves and in our relationship with others.
Can I just read out this quote? It's beautiful. it almost made me cry, but I can't cry, but it almost did. My daughter who died would have been 36 today. We know that the acute sorrow we feel after such a loss will run its course, but also that we will remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may come to take its place, even should it fill that place completely, it remains something else. And that's how it should be. It's the only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon.
Very moving. And what is he saying? He's saying, I can't, in a sense, he's being consoling, but he's also saying, you will be inconsolable. And there's something very beautiful and paradoxical about that. His acknowledgement of this massive loss. He's not trying to fill it with some trite words. He's saying, yes, this is big and it's massive and it's horrible, but I'm your friend. Just very, very beautiful stuff. And that is one of the problems with the pandemic. Where was the community involvement? We were living in streets where we knew our neighbours or the neighbours down from us might be in trouble. Did people rally round? Were people friends to each other in the fullest sense of that word? Now, I've had the conversations with lots of people about this, and there's a big debate. Some people said, yes, my street did rally round. They thought people were supportive. I'm not so sure. I think that people turned to governments and food banks and institutional solutions, but the pandemic illuminated something that there's a limit to what governments can do, and we need to look after each other. And I think the pandemic illuminated that underlying problem, which is what Camus said about his book, The Plague. The Plague actually reveals deeper underlying problems that were there all along, that were festering. We were ill before the plague came along. That's what Camus is saying.
And, well, thank you so much for being here. This was me jumping in to this world of YouTube and interviews with you. So jumping in the deep end, which I think you would be, you would recommend, you would prescribe. And thank you for allowing this to happen. Your book is really something that surprised me, and there are so many things I didn't really, so many chapters which I couldn't imagine would have tied into COVID, but do, and just generally really interesting. I'm not trying to sell your book for you, I'm just trying to be kind. You do have another one coming out about the NHS, which I would love to talk to you about. I have lots of personal experience with the NHS, the mental health services and whatnot. Yeah, it was, thank you so much for your time. And the book is now out, The Mental Vaccine for Covid-19 for everyone. I do recommend it wholeheartedly. I'm not a big reader, but I read that through in a night almost. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you soon at some point. Maybe talk about your NHS book and
Great.
whatnot.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
You're welcome.